Hi, everybody. Welcome back to The Reason We Learn. I'm Deb Philman, mom, homeschooler, educator. So it's Inauguration Eve, I guess. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm apprehensive, to say the least. That's putting it mildly, I think. I'm really nervous about this incoming administration because so far they've signaled pretty much naked hostility towards school choice and they've appointed two people to the Department of Education who are not only hostile to school choice, but they are very much in favor of critical race theory becoming the standard for education. In other words, that everything will have to pass through the critical race theory litmus test. That means every subject matter area, math and science included, will have to be vetted for equity. So your kids won't just be learning math or science or English or history. They will be learning the version of those things that has been deemed appropriate to address racial inequity, whatever that means. It's your best guess what that's going to look like when it's done. But suffice to say, everything will be about race. Everything will be about race. Every problem that comes up will be about race. Everything that doesn't work will be because of racism. If scores go down, that will be more proof that the system is racist, and you get my drift. So I came across this article from CATO. Did public schooling fail us? Obviously, a headline like that is going to catch my eye because to me, it's like, is water wet? But they start with the Capitol riots, just as I did in a video I did a couple weeks ago, where I said pretty much the same thing, that what we were witnessing was a failure to educate. But admittedly, I have not read this, so I'm sharing it with you at the same time I'm reading it. But I thought we'd go through it together, and if I have things to say, I'll stop and say them. But let's see what Cato has to say about it. I'm curious. Could public schools have prevented the disgraceful riotous attack on the U.S. Capitol? The question seems crazy. The mob, or at least a sizable portion of it, was outraged and apparently convinced that our system of government had gone off the rails, that it had cheated them. How could public schools have done anything to stop that? It would, of course, be wildly unfair to blame public schooling for the breakdown of social cohesion and civic norms we saw on display at the Capitol, except for one thing. Public schooling was largely created on the promise that it would prevent such breakdowns, a promise that continues to be wielded against alternatives such as charter schools or private school vouchers. We are told that public schooling is the cornerstone or bedrock of American democracy, and anything departing from it would cause unity and rule by the people to crumble. I'm going to come back to that. The notion that common schooling is crucial to democracy has some illustrious early propagators. Thomas Jefferson, generally not a proponent of energetic government, was perhaps the most famous founder to champion public schooling, calling for a basic publicly funded schooling system in Virginia. He wrote in 1786, "I think by far the most important bill in our whole code is that for the diffusion of knowledge among the people. No other sure foundation can be devised for the preservation of freedom and happiness." He was not alone in this belief, with John Adams and others also asserting the importance of widespread education delivered at least partially by public schools. Despite the enthusiasm for public schooling among some founding luminaries, little was established in their lifetimes. This was likely because most people simply did not believe that government should provide schools and education was already widespread. Historian Albert Fishlow estimates that by 1840, before much public schooling, more than 90% of white adult Americans were literate. African Americans were often barred by government from being educated. And while the early United States was far from perfectly democratic, in most states only white males who owned property, paid taxes, or had served in the military could vote, the nascent country was nonetheless advanced compared to the rest of the world when it came to rule by the people. That's an understatement. The person most prominently associated with the birth of eventual dominance of public schooling is Horace Mann, the 19th century Massachusetts reformer known as the father of the common schools. His crusade for public schooling began in 1837 when he became the first secretary of the newly formed Massachusetts State Board of Education. The need to create virtuous, dedicated citizens was his top selling point. As he declared in 1848, never will wisdom preside in the halls of legislation, and his profound utterances be recorded on the pages of the statute book until common schools or some other agency of equal power not yet discovered shall create a more far-seeing intelligence and a purer morality than has ever existed among communities of men. Notice men. It took several decades after man's crusade to solidify public schooling as the educational norm, but it eventually came to dominate. The earliest readily available data we have on where children have gone to school dates back to 1889, and they consistently show roughly 90% of students attending public schools. We also see more children spending increasing amounts of time in school as time passes, from about 65% of 5 to 17-year-olds spending roughly 78 days in school in 1869 to more than 94% spending 167 days today. Public schooling has been triumphant, yet we are a cleaved society with an increasingly weak commitment to democratic norms such as political tolerance and rule of law. The Capitol riot seems like prima facie evidence of dissolution of social cohesion and democratic values, especially coming off years of highly contentious elections, demonstrations against police brutality that sometimes spun off destruction, cancel culture, and more. Deeper analyses back up this seemingly obvious state of affairs. These include non-negligible support for unilateral presidential rule or even a military coup under certain conditions. Findings of markedly increased demonization of members of opposing political parties since the late 1960s, partisan affiliations being seen as legitimate negative factors to use in hiring decisions, declining trust in numerous American institutions, including government, and declining generalized trust. With the share of general social survey respondents agreeing that most people can be trusted, dropping from 46% in 1972 to 21% in 2018. Clearly, widespread public schooling has not prevented the decay of social cohesion and democratic norms, probably because it never had the power to do so. The education system cannot force people to like one another or democracy, nor can it maintain those things if people turn against them. Democratically controlled schooling is more likely to reflect decrepit attitudes than change them. That said, the system does not appear to do a good job of what it can directly impact. According to the most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress, civics and history exams, federal tests given to nationally representative samples of students, only 23% of public school 8th graders were proficient in civics, meaning they were able to do such things as explain 2 ways Congress fulfills a constitutional responsibility and identify the purpose of a country's constitution. In U.S. history, only 14% were proficient, including the ability to do such things as identify a right guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. Just the one. What about bringing diverse people together? The first reality that has long rendered public schools poor builders of bridges among disparate groups is that children tend to be assigned to schools based on their home addresses, and for reasons tied to both law and human nature, people tend to live with others who are similar, racially, economically, culturally to themselves. When students do attend schools with diverse populations, they tend to be in separated classrooms and social groups. And now we're told how wonderful that is, by the way. An inherent inability to create physical togetherness is just part of the public schooling cohesion building problem. By trying to encompass diverse people, public schooling ends up fostering political and social conflicts, which by their adversarial nature are more likely to have polarizing than unifying effects. Public schooling forces diverse people to fight over whose values, history, or preferred policies the school will uphold. This is not just theoretical. CATO's public schooling battle map catalogs over 2,400 values and identity-based conflicts collected since 2005, including about 350 at the state level, leaving no state citizens outside the battleground. In just the last year, we have seen conflicts over students' rights to express support for Donald Trump versus the rights of others to calm, orderly instruction, rights of teachers to champion Black Lives Matter against students' right not to be captive to an authority figure's political speech, battles over classic but sometimes offensive reading assignments, and much more. And of course, there's been a furious national debate over the New York Times 1619 Project, including its use in schools, which prompted a Trump-led drive to advance patriotic interpretations of U.S. history. This inherent tendency to force conflict may be a major reason that public schooling does a poor job of shaping citizens. It likely renders a lot of civics topics or encouraging civically engaged behaviors too hot to handle. Imagine discussing impeachment or encouraging protesting in many schools today. Imagine discussing impeachment or encouraging protesting in many schools today. In other words, can you imagine? As Louise Dubé, executive director of the civics education group iCivics, said about handling the contentious 2016 presidential campaign, teachers right now are afraid to teach the election. The parents freely choose private schools may well be one reason they appear to do a better job shaping citizens than public. Private schools can teach more rigorous, concrete civics because painful conflict is less of a danger to avoid. Rather than families being forced to fight against teachings they find unacceptable, they can simply leave. And most families likely would not choose schools with teachings they found intolerable to begin with. The only private school scores the National Assessment of Educational Progress publishes are for Roman Catholic schools, which constitute the largest single group of private K through 12 institutions. They perform much better than public schools. In civics, 41% of Catholic school 8th graders were proficient, as were 29% in U.S. history. These results certainly leave room for improvement, but they're roughly double the public school proficiency rates. Double. This despite Catholic schools for a long time having been considered by many people to be un-American arch-nemesis of public schools. Catholic school scores could importantly reflect characteristics of the students and families that choose them more than the schools themselves do. Though relatively low cost, their tuition is around $8,000 versus the roughly $15,000 per student spent in public schools. Catholic schools still must charge tuition and hence likely have better off students on average than public schools. That said, numerous studies have controlled statistically for student backgrounds and have typically found superior private school performance. As University of Arkansas professor Patrick Wolf itemizes in School Choice Myths, setting the record straight on education reform, the most methodologically rigorous studies have produced 27 findings on civic outcomes, with 14 showing a private school advantage, 12 no difference, and only 1 a public school advantage. Freedom wards off divisive conflict and enables private schools to teach rigorous curricula. It also enables them to have distinctive identities and cultures that render them better able to build bridges among diverse people. A school's distinctive ethos, whether it be Christian values, high academics, an arts focus, or more, immediately gives students who may be from, say, different racial backgrounds foundations to build new shared identities. Research supporting this is limited, but private schools overall have been found to have more peaceful, racially harmonious climates than public schools, while more focused studies have found greater voluntary mixing of students and intergroup friendships at private than public schools. Of course, while superior to public schooling, even universal school choice would be no panacea for polarization or disintegrating democratic norms. If large shares of people have highly divergent political views or strong desires to separate, neither school choice nor public schooling can make them change. Again, education is much more likely to reflect widespread beliefs than to alter them, which is why the failure to create unified, small d Democrats nationwide cannot be laid at the feet of the public schools. But that failure also puts the lie to the assertion that public schooling is a guarantor of a unified democratic society, and therefore sacrosanct. Indeed, the evidence points to school choice as the best means within education to foster a unified, civically healthy country. There are more great articles here, by the way, if you're interested on the subject of school choice and public school. Basically, the gist of it is public school is nothing they tell you it is. They tell you it's the most democratic form of education. It's the best way to preserve our democracy. And as I've just read to you, it's not. It's not. Precisely because it has to cater to everyone, it ends up catering to the loudest voice, which is kind of what democracy is about, isn't it? Mob rule, majority rule. Not really majority of the population in this case, though. It's the majority opinion. The majority opinion, the loudest opinion, the opinion most likely to generate controversy, the opinion that creates fear in the most people, the one that makes school administrators, school boards feel like they have to cater to it or something bad will happen, possibly something as bad as violence. And so you see people embracing ideas like critical race theory, anti-racism, BLM in the classroom, separating white from black students, telling white students they're bad because they're white, telling white teachers they're guilty. They're the reason for all of these problems. White teachers, not just, it couldn't be the system. Like I said in my last video, it couldn't be the system. It couldn't be the way we're doing it. No, it's race. Can you think of anything more backwards, more regressive, more evidence that this system has failed us utterly? I can't. So here we sit the night before an inauguration, more divided than we've been since roughly 1859. And I don't see where we go from here. I really don't. I created this channel hoping to raise awareness, hoping to get parents to pull their kids out of the schools, to walk away from the schools. I don't think there's any reforming this. As I've just read to you, better results can be found in private situations. I think even better results than that can be found in self-directed learning and homeschooling. You can handpick your teachers. You can handpick your curricula. You can handpick the social circumstances, every bit of it. And while some people might say, well, that's so undemocratic, and how are they going to... I'll make a video about it, explaining it. But the short answer is, believe it or not, when left to their own devices, children do much better than we do in all of these respects. It's perhaps high time we started listening to them and watching them and following them more, instead of trying to lead them around by the nose using things that have failed us as adults. We're not exactly great role models right now. In fact, we're terrible role models right now. So maybe the best thing we can do for our kids is not try to direct their education, but try to guide it, mentor it, facilitate it. Do some deschooling. Get them out of the schools. Let them decompress. Let them just play if they're little. Let them just read if they're older. Talk to them about what's important. Point them in the right direction. Help them find the right direction to find the things they can read or do or play with or explore, so they can learn, follow their interests. They got to be interested in it to learn it. But this isn't the way. This isn't the way. This is how we got to where we are. We've had public schooling. It's had a good run. It's not done well. In fact, it is done less well every year. Literally less well every year. There have been minor little tiny little upticks and fractions of percentages. And then it goes right back down. In what other area have we spent this much money on something that's gotten worse and worse and worse? If you did this in your private life, people would send you to the insane asylum. They would say that this person is a danger to him or herself and everybody else, because they're just burning money and things are getting worse. You would say, step away from the blackjack table is what you would say. And that's what we need to say about our schools too. So thanks for sharing this article with me, or sharing the time with me to read the article. I hope you found it interesting. If you do find this content interesting, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel. Share your comments in the comments section. Share the video with other people. I will put the link to this article in the description box, and I hope you have a good evening.